there is a development that has been circulating for several hours and that has not received anywhere near the attention it warrants. Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, and Qatar are actively weighing the option of pulling out of their existing agreements with the United States and walking back their future investment pledges in America. Take a moment to truly process what that means. Not Iran, not Russia, not China. Washington's own Gulf partners, the nations that have hosted American military installations for decades, the nations that signed hundreds of billions of dollars in investment commitments during Trump's visit to Riyadh in 2025. The nations whose sovereign wealth funds are deeply woven into the fabric of the American economy are now contemplating cutting the financial cord on the relationship. Liz, today, we are going to break this down the way it deserves, with real numbers, precise mechanisms, and genuine consequences across every dimension. Because behind this development lies something far more significant than a routine diplomatic spat between partners with differing preferences. What is unfolding right now is a fundamental renegotiation of the economic terms of an alliance, conducted not at a negotiating table, but through the threat of capital withdrawal on a scale Washington has never had to face from this direction before. To grasp the full weight of what is happening, you need to start with what these four countries actually represent for the American economy, because the scale of their financial presence is not what most coverage suggests. The seven main sovereign wealth funds of the Gulf region accounted for 43% of the total capital deployed by state investors globally in 2025, for a combined outflow of $126 billion in a single year. $126 billion in 12 months. And that figure was recorded before this crisis began, before a single missile had been launched, before a single refinery had been hit, before a single data center had been damaged. These four countries, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, and Qatar, are not simply military partners of the United States in a narrow security sense. They are massive, structurally embedded economic partners whose sovereign funds are threaded through entire sectors of the American economic landscape. Commercial real estate, technology firms, infrastructure projects, and private equity and investment vehicles across the country. The Qatar Investment Authority notably put capital into Jared Kushner's fund last year. The Abu Dhabi Investment Authority holds positions across American financial markets that would take years to fully unwind. These are the same nations that are now, according to multiple verified sources, considering the kind of withdrawal that nobody in Washington appears to have anticipated when this operation was conceived. To understand precisely why they are considering it, you need to understand what this operation has cost them in concrete and measurable terms since it began, because these numbers are not abstract. Since February 28th, these four countries have been turned into active Iranian target zones. Not because any of them officially took part in operations against Iran, none did, at least not openly, but because they host American military infrastructure and function as strategic pillars of Washington's regional architecture, they have absorbed the consequences of a conflict they did not start and were not consulted about before it was launched. The scale of what they have had to absorb is staggering. The UAE alone has been required to intercept 165 ballistic missiles, 2 cruise missiles, and 541 Iranian drones since Iranian counter-operations began. Kuwait intercepted 97 ballistic missiles and 283 drones. Qatar repelled 10 missiles and drone systems. Bahrain shot down additional missiles and drones in its own airspace. And these figures represent only the officially confirmed interceptions, the projectiles successfully neutralized before reaching their targets. They do not account for what got through. And in the UAE, 35 drones successfully broke through the country's multi-layered defenses, causing material damage that the Emirati Defense Ministry itself was compelled to acknowledge publicly. Fires in Dubai, structural damage near the Burj area, explosions in Abu Dhabi, and then the detail that halted analysts worldwide when it was first reported. A fire broke out in an Amazon Web Services data center in Dubai. That may represent the first time in modern history that a major cloud infrastructure facility has sustained damage in an active conflict setting. The implications for data sovereignty, cloud reliability, and the technology investment case for the entire region are still being digested. In Saudi Arabia, the Ras Tanura refinery was struck and taken offline. This is not a minor industrial facility, and Ras Tanura is one of the largest petroleum processing complexes on Earth, a crown asset of Saudi Aramco's production network and a critical node in global energy supply chains. Its removal from service, even temporarily, sends price signals through commodity markets that reach every importing nation on the planet. In Qatar, the consequences were immediate and globally felt. Qatar Energy was forced to fully halt its liquefied natural gas production following the strikes. Qatar is the world's largest LNG exporter. It became the energy lifeline of Europe after the severance of Russian gas supplies. The suspension of its output triggered a historic spike on global gas markets. Natural gas prices in Europe surged 66% in a single week. 66%. For European households and industries still managing energy cost pressures from the previous supply shock, that figure is not a market statistic. It is a direct economic blow. Beyond energy, the aviation dimension tells its own story. More than 70% of all flights into the UAE, Qatar, and Bahrain remained grounded in the days following the initial Iranian operations. Dubai International, the world's busiest airport by passenger volume, handling roughly 95 million travelers per year across approximately 8,500 weekly flights, was effectively shut down. Stock markets in Qatar and Saudi Arabia collapsed in the immediate aftermath. Exchanges in the UAE and Kuwait halted trading entirely rather than allow uncontrolled price discovery under conditions of extreme uncertainty. And that is the economic toll from the first week of a conflict these governments did not choose, did not plan for, and were not forewarned about. And it is growing larger with every passing day. Now for the central question this situation demands. Why are these governments actually weighing the withdrawal of their investments from the United States? What is the precise economic and strategic logic that takes a country from absorbing Iranian strikes on Monday to threatening American investment withdrawal by Friday? For these Gulf states, the current crisis threatens their economic model simultaneously across three distinct and compounding dimensions. Understanding all three is essential to grasping why the withdrawal threat is not a bluff, why it is not primarily emotional, and why Washington may have seriously miscalculated the tolerance of its regional partners. The first dimension is direct revenue destruction. Dubai, Doha, and Abu Dhabi have spent the better part of 2 decades building global reputations as premier centers of innovation, investment, entertainment, and connectivity. These are not petroleum backwaters hedging against oil price swings. They are sophisticated economies that have successfully drawn in international capital, international talent, international tourism, and international corporate headquarters by offering something specific: stability, reliability, and a predictable operating environment at the crossroads of global trade routes. Dubai International Airport at a standstill is not simply an aviation disruption. It is a direct assault on the foundational value proposition of the entire economic model. Every cancelled flight, every evacuated corporate office, every deferred investment decision by an international company reconsidering its regional base is a direct revenue loss that compounds over time. The second dimension is reputational damage of a kind that is exceptionally difficult to reverse. Qatar, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia have placed enormous strategic bets on connectivity and reliability as their bridge to a sustainable post-petroleum economic future. The Vision 2030 framework, the major investments in tourism infrastructure, the aggressive pursuit of international sporting events, the construction of significant data center capacity to attract technology companies, and all of these initiatives rest on a single premise: that these countries are safe, stable, and predictable places to invest, to operate, and to build. Active conflict zone status, even temporary, erodes that premise in ways that persist long after the immediate crisis has passed. The reputational damage from a single week of missile strikes, cancelled flights, and suspended stock markets can take years to fully repair in the minds of international investors making long-horizon capital decisions. The third and deepest dimension is the destruction of the regional diplomatic architecture these governments had painstakingly built over the preceding decade. This is the dimension that generates the most genuine anger in Gulf capitals, and the one outside observers most consistently underestimate. The Gulf had spent years constructing a carefully calibrated framework of regional tension management, a set of diplomatic understandings, economic interdependencies, and back-channel relationships designed to sustain a workable coexistence with Iran without requiring either confrontation or surrender. In 2023, Saudi Arabia and Iran restored full diplomatic relations after 7 years of complete hostility, a normalization that required enormous diplomatic investment and careful management of domestic political sensitivities on both sides. Qatar and Iran share the South Pars and North Dome gas field, one of the largest natural gas reservoirs on Earth, and have maintained a necessarily pragmatic working relationship around it. But Oman had been serving for years as a trusted and effective mediator between Washington and Tehran on multiple sensitive matters. All of that accumulated diplomatic capital, a decade of patient construction, was erased in days without any of these governments being consulted before the decision was made. Now consider the specific economic calculation these governments are running as they weigh the withdrawal option. These countries had not merely expressed goodwill toward the United States. They had signed contractual commitments of enormous scale. Military procurement agreements worth tens of billions of dollars with American defense contractors, investment pledges in American infrastructure, technology, and energy projects. And Saudi Arabia alone had announced commitments of several $100 billion over 10 years during Trump's Riyadh visit in 2025, a figure presented at the time as a landmark achievement of American economic diplomacy. These commitments were made on an implicit understanding that the security relationship with Washington provided protection, predictability, and strategic stability. That understanding has now been shattered. The withdrawal logic is straightforward. These governments are being asked to absorb the costs, economic, reputational, infrastructural, and diplomatic, of a military operation they did not request, did not endorse, and were not informed about before it was launched. Their initial frustration at Washington for initiating operations while diplomatic channels were still actively being pursued was rapidly overtaken by a deeper and more lasting anger. The anger of watching Iranian missiles and drones strike their own cities, their own refineries, their own data centers, their own airports, as a direct consequence of hosting American military assets in a conflict Washington chose to start without their input. But here lies the harsh paradox at the center of their position. On one side, the Iranian strikes have temporarily drawn them closer to Washington. American air defense systems are actively protecting Gulf airspace right now. On March 1st, the Five Gulf Cooperation Council states joined Jordan and the United States in a formal joint statement condemning Iranian operations and affirming their collective right to self-defense. They are not breaking with Washington. They are not switching sides. But on the other side, they are absorbing a mounting and accelerating economic bill for a conflict they do not control, cannot exit, and were never given the opportunity to weigh in on before it began. The investment withdrawal threat is not a diplomatic protest. It is a precisely calibrated economic signal delivered in the only language that reliably produces policy adjustment in Washington, the language of financial consequence. The message, translated from the diplomatic to the direct, is this: if you continue without managing the economic damage you are inflicting on us, we will deliver comparable damage through the mechanisms we control. Let us now look at the petroleum numbers specifically, because the energy dimension is where the most immediate and most globally consequential leverage sits. Maritime transport through the Strait of Hormuz has been severely disrupted. Approximately 30% of the world's seaborne crude oil trade moves through that narrow passage. Nearly 20% of global LNG supply travels through the same choke point. Numerous commercial vessels are currently anchored outside the strait, with shipping operators and commodity trading firms having opted to avoid the passage entirely rather than accept the risk premium of transit. These disruptions have already affected roughly 20% of global oil supplies moving through Hormuz and pushing Brent crude prices from around $70 to over $80 per barrel within days. And that is only the beginning of the price trajectory if current conditions hold. If Saudi production capacity remains impaired following the Ras Tanura strike, if Qatar does not resume LNG output, if global shipping companies maintain their Hormuz avoidance posture, the price forecasts from commodity analysts move into territory that creates serious political consequences for every major oil-importing economy. The figures being discussed in serious analytical circles are not marginal adjustments. Analysts are projecting $120, $130, even $150 per barrel in a scenario where the disruption proves structural rather than temporary. For Trump specifically, this trajectory creates an existential political problem his administration has not yet publicly acknowledged. He campaigned on an explicit and repeatedly stated promise to bring American energy prices down, to deliver relief at the gas pump as a central pillar of his economic agenda. The midterm elections of November 2026 are now less than 9 months away. Every additional dollar at the pump is a direct, visible, and politically attributable cost that voters will not need economic analysts to explain to them. And right now, energy prices are not falling. They are climbing. The gap between the campaign promise and the lived economic reality of American consumers is widening with each passing day of this operation. Iran's strategic approach in targeting Gulf infrastructure is precisely calibrated to exploit this vulnerability. For Tehran, and striking Dubai carries greater economic impact on the global system and greater political impact on the governments it wants to pressure than targeting isolated military installations would. Dubai has an incomparable international profile, A fire in a Dubai data center generates market reactions and international coverage that a strike on a remote desert facility never would. Tehran is calculating that the economically devastating effects of its Gulf operations will generate sufficient cascading pressure on the Gulf monarchies to push those governments to press Washington toward a ceasefire. The mechanism playing out in real time is a precisely engineered pressure cascade. Iran targets Gulf economies. Gulf economies absorb severe damage. Gulf governments channel that damage into political pressure on Washington. Washington faces the choice between sustaining the operation and forfeiting the economic cooperation of the regional partners that make the operation logistically and financially viable. The investment withdrawal threat is the Gulf's formal entry into that cascade. Their message to Washington through economic signaling is unambiguous. If you will not manage the consequences Iran is imposing on our economies, we will impose comparable consequences on yours. Now let us examine, with genuine analytical precision, what happens across the three realistic scenarios if this withdrawal actually materializes, because these scenarios carry very different consequences and need to be distinguished clearly. The first and most probable scenario in the near term is a partial withdrawal, serving primarily as a political signal. Our Gulf governments suspend certain forward investment commitments, freeze contract signatures that are pending but not yet finalized, redirect some sovereign fund flows toward non-American destinations, and communicate clearly but through private channels to Washington that the full economic relationship is now explicitly conditional on demonstrated movement toward de-escalation. The immediate financial impact of this scenario is more symbolic than catastrophic, but the political signal it delivers is powerful, unambiguous, and difficult for an administration focused on economic performance to ignore. It represents a formal notification from Washington's most financially significant regional partners that the alliance has entered conditional territory. No, the second scenario involves a more significant and sustained reallocation of sovereign fund capital away from American assets. This is where the financial consequences become measurable in ways that affect American households and businesses rather than just diplomatic relationships. Gulf sovereign funds deployed $126 billion globally in 2025. If a meaningful portion of those flows, say 20 to 30%, is systematically redirected away from American Treasury bonds, American real estate, and American equity markets toward European, Asian, or emerging market destinations, the effects ripple through the American financial system in ways that are visible and consequential. Reduced demand for Treasury bonds pushes yields higher. Higher yields increase the cost of servicing the American national debt at a moment when debt service costs are already consuming a historically large share of the federal budget. Higher borrowing costs cascade through mortgage markets, corporate financing, and consumer credit. The damage is not sudden or catastrophic, but it is real, it is sustained, and it is politically attributable in ways that matter to an administration already navigating domestic economic pressures. The third scenario, a full rupture of military procurement contracts, is the least probable in the near term, but carries the most symbolically devastating implications if it were to occur. Saudi Arabia and the UAE are among the largest purchasers of American defense equipment in the world. Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Raytheon, and other major defense contractors hold contracts in the Gulf worth tens of billions of dollars across multiple ongoing programs. A sudden and comprehensive cancellation of those contracts would constitute a genuine industrial earthquake, generating immediate job losses in American defense manufacturing, undermining the unit economics of production programs that rely on international orders to remain cost competitive, and sending a signal to every other American defense partner globally about the reliability of the alliance relationships that underpin those commercial arrangements. Before closing, there is one additional dimension that cannot be overlooked, and that Washington has almost certainly not adequately modeled in its pre-operation planning. China. So more than 38% of Chinese crude oil imports transported by sea originate from the Middle East. China has a structural economic interest in rapid regional stabilization rather than prolonged conflict. Sustained Gulf disruption directly raises its own energy costs and supply chain vulnerabilities. But China simultaneously has a profound strategic interest in exploiting this precise moment to deepen and formalize its economic relationships with Gulf partners who are actively seeking ways to reduce their dependence on the American-centered financial and security architecture. If Gulf sovereign wealth funds begin systematically redirecting capital flows away from the United States, Beijing will be positioned to absorb a significant share of those redirected flows, and deepening financial integration with the Gulf at exactly the moment when American influence in the region is being tested. The long-term geopolitical consequence of that capital reorientation, a sustained deepening of Gulf-China financial integration at the expense of Gulf-America financial integration, is almost certainly not what Washington was calculating when it made the decision to launch operations without consulting its regional partners. What this situation reveals at its most fundamental level is something that students of foreign policy understand clearly, but that political leaders in every era consistently underestimate at precisely the moments it matters most. In the contemporary world, military power and economic power are not separate domains that can be managed independently. You cannot conduct large-scale military operations in a region as economically central as the Gulf without generating economic consequences that feed back into the political sustainability of the operation itself. You cannot ask your allies to absorb the costs of a conflict they did not choose without eventually compelling them to make calculations about whether continued alliance loyalty actually serves their national interests, calculations they would far prefer not to have to make. Trump himself stated publicly that Iranian retaliatory operations against Gulf countries had been, in his words, probably the biggest surprise of the operation to date. That statement is more revealing than it may have been intended to be. If the closest regional allies of the United States are absorbing economically devastating Iranian retaliatory strikes, and Washington's characterization of that outcome is surprise, it means this scenario was not in the operational planning. It means the economic feedback loops from Gulf vulnerability to American alliance costs were not adequately modeled before the decision to act was taken. And when the economic scenarios are absent from the plan, the allies who end up paying the unplanned bill eventually stop waiting for Washington to acknowledge the problem and begin taking unilateral action to protect their own interests. The Gulf investment withdrawal threat is precisely that kind of unilateral action. It is the decision of allies who were not consulted, who are experiencing consequences they did not choose and cannot easily escape, and who have identified an economic lever sufficiently powerful to force the conversation that diplomatic channels have not yet managed to produce. What is being negotiated right now is not a military outcome. It is the price that Washington's Gulf partners are willing to pay for an operation they did not vote for. And that price is rising every single day. That the current trajectory continues without a credible path toward de-escalation that protects their economic interests alongside American strategic objectives.